This figure, this strange woman with a basket on her head and a cornucopia in her arm, assailed by this young child, this is a figure of abundance, the dovizia. And the dovizia is an important image for a Florentine person. And this, made to be sold to a Florentine, although we know not who, is part of their identity as a city. In the 15th century, the great sculptor Donatello made a figure of the dovizia, of abundance, to be placed on a column in the old marketplace of the city. His dovizia was made out of local Florentine sandstone, known as macigno, or later pietra serena. Over time, because pietra serena does not do well in rain, it gradually simply melted away, and by the 19th century had disappeared altogether. However, at the time that this thing was made, in the early part of the 16th century, the dovizia was one of the most prominent public symbols of everything that the Florentines wanted to believe about their city. That this was a place of abundance, this was a place of provision, this was a place which would feed its people. And that's what dovizia does. She brings all the abundance of the Florentine contado into the middle of the city. She represents, therefore, something which is important to the city, and the reproduction of Donatello's image made in the 15th century continued through that century and into the next. This clearly is not in the same medium, but rather in glazed terracotta. Glazed terracotta was another of the products of Florence of the 15th century, which might be thought of as part of the abundance of the city, that extraordinary outpouring of technical and creative ability in the 15th century, part of which was the development of terracotta which could be displayed outdoors because of the glazes that were applied to it. The Della Robbia family, in whose workshops these technical developments were experimented with and perfected, were amongst the most important sculptural families of Florence in the 15th century, notwithstanding they were working in a medium which today we seldom think of as sculpture. Giovanni Della Robbia, who was the head of the workshop at the time in the early 16th century when this was produced, was making objects not simply to commission for major Florentine families, like his forebears had done for the Medici, but also making objects for consumption by anybody who chose to buy them. It would be easy, because this is quite a substantial object, to imagine that it had been made to commission for a Florentine family. If we look carefully though, I think that that might not be the case. So if we look at the inscription in that panel at the front of the object, it says, Gloria et divitiae in domo tua. Glory and prosperity in your home. This seems to me to be far too generic an inscription to have been put on there for a specific family. Also, if we look all over this thing, it's impossible to find an armorial bearing of any kind. There's no heraldry on there. There's nothing to indicate ownership by a particular family. And if you're going to commission a piece of sculpture from a substantial and significant workshop, then to have your identity inscribed on it would be almost de rigueur in 15th and 16th century Florence. It's difficult to imagine this, therefore, as a private commission. But that makes its presence in the workshop, as a product of the workshop, all the more interesting, because it tells us that by this stage, the Della Robbia are producing really substantial objects, and that there is a market in Florence for this kind of symbolic presence to be brought into the home. That you are prepared to put something as substantial as this to underline your fiorentinità, your presence in this community, and your devotion to this particular image of abundance, which has dominated the centre of the city by this stage for nearly a century. So we've got a thing here which was made to be bought rather than made because somebody commissioned it. What we should do is look at it carefully and see what we can see. The thing about dovizia, of course, is that she has to be abundant, and the abundance here is amply demonstrated in that basket on top of her head, filled with zucchini, pomegranates, grapes, lemons, all the sumptuous produce of the Florentine contado. The same produce is overflowing from the cornucopia she holds in the crook of her arm. This is an abundance that represents truly the fertility of Florence, all that it has to offer. If Divizia brings us the produce of Florence, she also says something about the fertility, the fecundity of Florence. Here is this child clutching at her skirts. She produces everything that we need. This thing then, this extraordinary object, is a representation of Florence in any number of ways. In its devotional life, in its mythic sense of its place within that fertile central Italian landscape, and in that sense of where its riches derive from. Going back to the inscription, it's worth noting that this is a speaking object. The inscription calls down a blessing on the house in which it's placed. In other words, this object is praying for you as you walk past it. When you're in bed, the object is praying for you, calling down prosperity and glory onto your home, even when you are not. Speaking objects have a particular power. They are present in people's homes because we like what they say. I think it would be mean to think of this in terms of live, laugh and love, but there is something about what do we want to read and to see and to hear when we look at objects in our home. Why does this object act as an appropriate vessel for that message? It's because glory and blessing are present in every aspect of it. Glory and blessing are there in the fruit. Glory and blessing is there in the child. Glory and blessing are there in the lamb. This is an object which does what it says in its iconography, in the way it's modelled, in the richness of its colouring, and in the text which has been appended to it. This is a clever object. It's an eloquent object. We might balk at the sheer garishness of it, but its appropriateness is not for us. Its appropriateness is for the people into whose city it was made and into whose homes it was intended to go. And for them, this is a perfect object for saying who they are, where they live, and why that is all a good thing.